The 8 late-night guests who made Johnny Carson hate his job. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the king of late-night TV. He had perfect timing, nice charm from the Midwest, and that famous eyebrow raise. Carson seemed to easily get through more than 4,500 episodes of The Tonight Show. Night after night, he welcomed the biggest stars in movies, politics, and sports. He always seemed happy and nice. But behind that perfect smile and fancy suit, there were times when he got really frustrated and angry. Carson almost never let people see this side of him. Most guests knew the rules of The Tonight Show, but a few guests tested Carson's patience way too much. They made things so tense you could feel it in the air. Today, we're going to tell you about the 8 guests who made TV's calmest host secretly hate when they came on his show. These weren't just weird interviews or boring talks. These were times that made Johnny Carson, a man who loved his job more than anything, wish he didn't have to do it. Some guests wanted to control everything. Others were completely wild and crazy. Some tried to shock people on purpose, while others just didn't understand what was happening. But they all did the same thing. They messed up Carson's careful balance of being surprising but still organized. They turned what should have been easy TV into really hard work for the man behind the desk. Stay with me because learning about these awful interviews tells us more about Carson himself. How perfect he wanted things to be, what he worried about, and what he thought TV should be like. This shows more than any normal Tonight Show highlight video ever could. This is Johnny Carson like you've rarely seen him, pushed to the point where he almost lost his cool by guests who either didn't understand or didn't care about the careful art of late-night talk shows. Really is the fact that nowhere in the world are any American soldiers fighting in a war. And that's another reason why Bob Hope is here. Bob Hope treated Carson's show like a big advertisement sign. Bob Hope was like American entertainment royalty. He was a comedy legend whose career went from old variety shows to radio, movies, and TV. His shows for soldiers made him a hero to many generations of military people. His Christmas specials were something Americans always watched. To most viewers, Hope appearing on The Tonight Show seemed like a perfect match. 2 comedy greats talking together, with the older star passing wisdom to the newer one. But behind the scenes, these appearances had become really painful for Carson and his workers. By the 1980s, Hope had changed from a lively comedian into something more like a walking brand name. He was a legend who was trading on his old fame while just going through the motions like a robot. Hope would walk on to The Tonight Show to promote his specials and golf tournaments. He offered nothing that felt real or spontaneous. He refused to actually talk normally and insisted on using cards with prepared answers, a former Tonight Show producer remembered. For Johnny, who valued real conversation more than anything else, this way of doing TV felt like a personal insult. The problem started way before Hope even got to the studio. While most guests worked through the show's normal booking process, Hope's team would basically tell them when he would appear. They expected the show to change their schedule to fit his, no matter what other plans they had. Once these appearances were scheduled, Hope's writers would bring a stack of cards with prepared responses that often had nothing to do with the questions Carson might actually ask. There was no real conversation, explained a longtime Tonight Show worker. Johnny would ask a question and Hope would look down at his cards and say whatever line was next, whether it answered the question or not. It was the most fake kind of TV possible, and Carson hated every second of it. What made these talks especially frustrating for Carson was how different Hope's approach was from his own way of thinking about TV. Carson believed in getting ready for shows, but also in the magic of things happening unexpectedly. The surprise moment, the real laugh, the honest reaction. Hope by the 1980s had given up any pretense of being spontaneous. Instead, he did rigidly controlled appearances that were only focused on promoting his latest special, tournament, or project. Carson rarely talked about his frustrations publicly. He kept the respectful behavior that was expected when dealing with a legend like Hope. But in a rare moment of honesty during an interview with TV Guide magazine, Carson revealed his true feelings. He just has to show up with a golf club and a Reagan joke and he's on. He doesn't have to be funny, and I don't like that. This anger eventually led to an amazing decision that was never officially announced, but became something everyone inside NBC knew about. Sometime in the late 1980s, Carson quietly banned Hope from The Tonight Show. This was a shocking move given Hope's legendary status and long relationship with the TV network. It was never publicly stated. A senior NBC executive from that time period confirmed, but people inside NBC knew Hope was not welcome on The Tonight Show anymore. The instruction was clear. Don't call Hope's people. And if they call us, say we're completely booked up. For a host who had built his reputation on being diplomatic and professional, this behind-the-scenes ban showed just how deeply Hope's approach to TV had offended Carson's beliefs about what was right. It wasn't just that Hope was promoting himself. All guests did that to some extent. But he treated The Tonight Show as nothing more than a billboard, giving viewers no genuine moments or real conversation in exchange for the platform he was given. When Carson retired in 1992, Hope was noticeably absent from the farewell shows that featured Carson's favorite and most memorable guests. The comedy legend who had once been a Tonight Show regular had been effectively erased from the program's final chapter. This was the ultimate sign of how completely Carson had rejected Hope's approach to television. Would you please welcome Mr. Warmth Don? Applause. Don Rickles was too wild for Johnny's tightly controlled format. While Bob Hope represented the problem of a guest who was too controlled, Don Rickles gave Carson the opposite challenge. He was like a comedy hurricane who would blow into the studio and mess up Carson's carefully balanced format within seconds of taking the stage. Known as Mr. Warmth, a deeply ironic nickname since he wasn't warm at all, Rickles had built his career on insult comedy. He would target audience members, other celebrities, and hosts with rapid-fire mean jokes that somehow managed to be both cutting and loving at the same time. When Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show, all normal rules went out the window, including Carson's position as the one in control. Rickles was chaotic, loud and unpredictable, explained a former Tonight Show director. Carson liked dry, structured conversations, not being made fun of or run over by someone else. They were friends, but Carson sometimes refused to have him on alone and only booked him when there were other guests too. The typical Rickles appearance would begin normally enough, with Carson introducing him and Rickles walking out to greet the host. But within moments, Rickles would take over, grabbing Carson's tie, stealing his cigarette, or jumping from his chair to talk to the audience directly. Often he would grab Ed McMahon's microphone or take over Carson's desk, literally and figuratively pushing the host out of his central position. Rickles would hijack the desk and Carson would retreat into a fake smile, noted a cameraman who worked on many of these episodes. If you knew Johnny well, you could see a certain tension in his jaw, even as he was laughing. He appreciated Rickles' talent but hated losing control of his own show. Carson's response to Rickles was complicated by genuine friendship and professional respect. Unlike Hope, whose appearances felt mechanical and like business transactions, Rickles was definitely funny and spontaneous, qualities Carson valued highly. The problem wasn't that Rickles was boring. It was that his particular style of comedy required him to dominate every interaction, leaving Carson in the unusual position of playing second fiddle on his own show. This situation led to a solution that showed Carson's strategic approach to difficult guests. Rather than banning Rickles completely, Carson often insisted that he appear only in panel segments with other guests. This format watered down Rickles' impact, giving him multiple targets for his insults and preventing him from completely taking over the show. Johnny would tell the people who booked guests, "If Don's coming on, make sure we have at least 2 other guests that night," recalled a Tonight Show worker. It was his way of managing the Rickles tornado, giving it more than one target to hit. The tension between Carson's controlled approach and Rickles' chaotic energy produced some of The Tonight Show's most memorable moments. This included the famous incident when Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting, and Carson later interrupted Rickles' dinner at a restaurant for an on-camera confrontation. These moments worked precisely because they represented rare breaks in Carson's carefully maintained composure. What made the Carson-Rickles relationship different from other difficult guest situations was the genuine love between the two men. Carson recognized Rickles' comic genius and understood that his act required a certain loss of control. Rickles, for his part, respected Carson enough to dial back his most aggressive tendencies when he sensed the host growing genuinely uncomfortable. "They had an understanding," explained a mutual friend. Rickles could push further with Johnny than almost anyone else, but even he knew there was a line he shouldn't cross. If he felt Carson genuinely tensing up, he'd pull back slightly. It was a comedy dance between two masters. This delicate balance allowed Rickles to remain a Tonight Show regular throughout Carson's time as host, despite occasionally making the host visibly uncomfortable. Unlike some of the other guests on our list, Rickles' disruptions came from talent and energy rather than ego or awkwardness, a distinction that Carson, himself a student of comedy, clearly recognized and respected, even when it temporarily made him hate his job. They're still cheering the monologue. "Yeah, I was going to ask you who wrote your 'How are you, Madonna?'" The guest who refused to play by his rules. By 1987, Madonna had already transformed herself from a dance-pop novelty to global superstar to controversial cultural icon. Her Who's That Girl world tour was selling out huge stadiums, and her evolution from Lucky Star to Like a Prayer had established her as an artist who was determined to control her own image and story. When she appeared on The Tonight Show in July of that year, viewers watched a collision between two completely different approaches to being famous: Carson's measured Midwestern reserve versus Madonna's provocative, boundary-pushing personality. She was vulgar, flirtatious, and self-promoting, and made sexual jokes that forced Johnny into awkward laughter, recalled a Tonight Show staff writer who was there for the appearance. He later told friends she was one of the few guests who made him feel like he wasn't running the show anymore. From the moment Madonna took her seat, the traditional power balance of The Tonight Show was turned upside down. Rather than politely answering Carson's questions, Madonna challenged them, often responding with sexual suggestions or deliberately provocative statements that left Carson visibly flustered. When he tried to steer the conversation toward her career accomplishments, she redirected toward controversies and provocations. "Watch Johnny's body language during that interview," suggested a body language expert who has studied Carson's hosting style. "He literally leans away from her, creates physical distance. His smile doesn't reach his eyes." These are classic discomfort signals from someone who prides himself on never being shaken up. What made the Madonna appearance particularly challenging for Carson was her deliberate subversion of the Tonight Show format. Most guests, even difficult ones, accepted certain unwritten rules. The host asks the questions, the guest provides entertaining answers, and both work together to create an engaging segment. Madonna rejected this formula entirely, treating Carson less as a host to be respected and more as an establishment figure to be challenged. Madonna came in with an agenda, explained an NBC executive who was there that night. She wasn't there to promote a project or to engage in the typical talk show small talk. She was there to provoke a reaction, to create a moment that would get people talking. And in that sense, she succeeded brilliantly, but at Carson's expense. The gender dynamics of the encounter added another layer of complexity. Carson had built his career interviewing beautiful female celebrities, often with a gentle flirtatiousness that was considered charming in that era. Madonna turned this dynamic on its head, taking control of the sexual tension and wielding it in ways that made Carson visibly uncomfortable. Johnny was used to being the one who could make a suggestive joke or flirtatious comment, noted a female writer who worked on the show. With Madonna, he suddenly found himself on the receiving end of that energy, and he clearly didn't know how to respond. It was like watching someone who always leads on the dance floor suddenly being forced to follow. After the interview, Carson reportedly told his producer, "Let's not do that again." While he didn't explicitly ban Madonna from future appearances, he made it clear he had no interest in repeating the experience. When Madonna's publicists later approached The Tonight Show about another appearance, they were politely but firmly told that the schedule was full for the foreseeable future. The Madonna interview stands as a fascinating cultural document, a moment when the old guard of entertainment, represented by Carson's controlled, somewhat formal approach, confronted the new generation of stars who saw provocation and boundary pushing as central to their artistic identity. Carson, master of television that he was, maintained his composure throughout the segment, But those who knew him well could see how deeply the encounter had disrupted his sense of control and comfort on his own show. "Would you welcome Truman Capote?" "Truman, I'm just fine." "Excuse me, I'm still coming on here." Truman Capote was slurring, rude, and drunk. Truman Capote had built his reputation as one of America's most brilliant writers with works like Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the mid-1970s, however, he was increasingly known for his public drinking problems, bitter fights with former friends, and crazy behavior at social events. His appearance with Carson gave viewers an uncomfortable look at a literary genius in decline, and gave Carson one of his most challenging interviews. Capote showed up clearly drunk, gave answers that made no sense, and made Johnny visibly uncomfortable during the live broadcast, recalled a stage manager who worked that night. It was one of Carson's most infamous train wreck interviews. Never invited back. From the moment Capote walked on stage, it was obvious something was wrong. His speech was slurred, his movements unsteady, and his train of thought nearly impossible to follow. Carson, the ultimate professional that he was, tried to guide the conversation toward coherent territory, asking straightforward questions about Capote's work and upcoming projects. Capote responded with rambling, sometimes nonsensical answers, punctuated by inappropriate laughter and comments that had nothing to do with the questions. "Johnny had a technique for dealing with difficult guests," explained a former Tonight Show producer. "He would simplify his questions, shorten the segment, and try to find some aspect of the guest's personality that could create a salvageable television moment." With Capote, none of these techniques worked. The man was simply too impaired to engage in even basic conversation. As the interview went on, Capote became increasingly hostile, making mean remarks about other writers and celebrities, including several who were friends of Carson's. At one point, he made a put-down comment about Carson himself, suggesting that the host wasn't smart enough to discuss serious literature. Carson's reaction, a tight smile and a quick glance toward Ed McMahon, spoke volumes about his discomfort. "You could see Johnny calculating whether to end the segment early," remembered a camera operator. "He had that power. He could simply cut things short if they were going badly." But he also had a strong sense of professionalism, a belief that the host's job was to make even difficult guests look as good as possible. With Capote, that became an impossible task. The audience reaction made the awkwardness worse. Initially, there were uncomfortable laughs, as viewers assumed Capote was perhaps playing a character or being deliberately provocative in an amusing way. As the segment continued and his impairment became undeniable, the laughter died away, replaced by a tense silence broken only by scattered, nervous giggles. Carson never explicitly discussed the Capote interview in later years, but his actions spoke clearly. Truman Capote was never invited back to The Tonight Show. When Capote's name came up in production meetings as a potential guest to promote later books or appearances, Carson would simply shake his head and say, "I think we've had quite enough of Mr. Capote." The Capote interview shows a particular challenge Carson faced throughout his career: how to handle guests who were clearly struggling with drinking and drug problems. As a host who enjoyed drinking himself and was known to be kind to performers dealing with personal demons, Carson was generally sympathetic to guests who might have had a few too many before appearing on the show. But Capote crossed a line from simply being drunk to being actively hostile and incoherent, creating television that was not just awkward, but essentially unwatchable. Johnny believed the audience tuned in to be entertained, not to witness someone's public breakdown, explained a longtime friend of Carson's. The Capote interview wasn't just bad television. It felt exploitative, like taking advantage of someone who clearly needed help rather than a camera pointed at him. That crossed an ethical line for Johnny that he wasn't willing to cross again. The Capote incident represents an extreme version of a problem Carson occasionally faced throughout his career: the challenge of interviewing brilliant, complex individuals whose personal struggles sometimes overshadowed their professional accomplishments. While Carson could be ruthless in cutting off guests who were boring or self-indulgent, he showed a genuine compassion for those battling deeper demons, even when, as in Capote's case, they made his job temporarily unbearable. And we walked in, and it was really outside it looked beautiful, but inside the temperature was about 10 degrees below zero. Shelley Winters was the guest who never shut up. Shelley Winters began her career as a glamorous blonde actress before transforming herself into a serious, dramatic actress, winning 2 Academy Awards and establishing herself as one of Hollywood's most respected performers. She was also, as Johnny Carson discovered over multiple appearances, one of the most exhausting guests in Tonight Show history, a woman whose stream-of-consciousness conversational style tested the limits of even Carson's legendary patience. Winters constantly interrupted, went off topic, and made jokes that fell flat, remembered a Tonight Show associate producer. Johnny often physically pulled back when she launched into tangents. He reportedly asked producers, "Why do we keep booking her?" Unlike some difficult guests who appeared once and were never invited back, Winters was a recurring presence on The Tonight Show, appearing dozens of times throughout Carson's time as host. This repeated exposure made her particular conversational style all the more challenging for Carson, who knew exactly what he was in for each time she walked on stage. The typical Winters appearance followed a predictable pattern. Carson would ask a simple opening question, hoping to establish a clear direction for the conversation. Winters would begin answering, then immediately veer into a seemingly unrelated story, often about one of her famous ex-husbands or lovers. As Carson attempted to steer back to the original topic, Winters would interrupt him with yet another tangent, creating a conversational ping-pong match that the host rarely won. Johnny had this subtle physical tell when a guest was losing him, explained a cameraman who worked closely with Carson for years. He would start drumming his fingers on the desk very slightly, almost imperceptibly. With most guests, you might see this once or twice in a segment. With Shelley Winters, it was practically continuous. What made Winters particularly challenging was her apparent obliviousness to social cues. When Carson would try to wrap up a story that had gone on too long, Winters would plow ahead as if she hadn't noticed his attempt to move the conversation forward. When he would try to interject a question, she would talk over him. When he would shift his body language to signal it was time to move on, she would settle more firmly into her chair and launch into another lengthy story. You could see the inner struggle on Johnny's face, recalled a longtime viewer who attended several Winters appearances as an audience member. He was too professional to be overtly rude, but there were moments where he looked like he was contemplating just getting up and walking off the set, until she ran out of stories. Behind the scenes, Carson's frustration with Winters was an open secret. After particularly exhausting segments, he would return to his dressing room and ask his producers, "Why do we keep booking her?" The answer was simple. Despite the conversational chaos she created, Winters was an important figure in Hollywood with genuine accomplishments and name recognition. Banning her outright would have been seen as disrespectful to a legitimate star. Instead, Carson developed strategies for managing Winters' appearances. He would book her in later segments when time constraints could provide a natural end to her tangents. He would sometimes pair her with other guests, creating a panel discussion where her tendency to dominate could be somewhat watered down, and he developed a more assertive interruption technique specifically for Winters, jumping in more firmly than he typically would with other guests. Johnny created what the staff called the Shelley Protocol, revealed a former Tonight Show writer, shorter segments, more direct questions, and permission for Johnny to cut her off more abruptly than he would with other guests. It never completely solved the problem, but it made her appearances somewhat more manageable. What's particularly interesting about the Carson-Winters dynamic is that despite his private frustration, Carson maintained a cordial relationship with her throughout his career. He recognized her talent and accomplishments even as her conversational style drove him to distraction. This professional respect maintained despite personal exasperation exemplifies Carson's approach to his role as host, prioritizing the audience's experience and the guest's dignity, even when doing so tested his own considerable patience. Little people. Yeah, we don't use the word that begins with an M because there's some bad taste. I said Dick Shawn was too absurd for even Carson's patience. Dick Shawn occupied a unique position in American comedy, a performer whose surrealistic avant-garde approach pushed the boundaries of what mainstream audiences considered humor. Best known for his roles as Lorenzo Saint Dubois, LSD, in The Producers, and the hippie actor playing Hitler in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, Sean's comedy often ventured into territory that was more performance art than traditional stand-up. While this approach worked brilliantly in certain contexts, The Tonight Show proved to be a particularly challenging venue for Sean's unconventional style. Comedian known for bizarre performance art-level bits that left the audience confused, and Carson stone-faced, explained a comedy historian who has studied Sean's career. Johnny disliked performers who treated the show like their own private experiment. Unlike many of the guests on our list, Sean wasn't difficult due to ego, substance abuse, or conversational domination. Rather, his appearances challenged Carson because they defied the basic format of talk show entertainment, often leaving both the host and the audience unsure how to respond to routines that seemed deliberately designed to provoke confusion rather than laughter. A typical Sean appearance might begin conventionally enough, with Carson introducing him and attempting to engage in standard talk show banter. But Sean would quickly subvert expectations, responding to straightforward questions with abstract monologues, sudden character shifts, or extended silences. Sometimes he would break into seemingly spontaneous physical routines, using the entire stage area and occasionally venturing into the audience in ways that made Carson's producers nervous. Johnny valued entertainment that connected with the audience, noted a former Tonight Show director. He understood sophisticated humor, irony, even absurdism when it was accessible. But Sean's material often seemed designed specifically to alienate viewers, to make them uncomfortable rather than entertained. That was antithetical to Carson's whole philosophy of television. Carson's discomfort during these segments was evident in his body language and facial expressions. While he maintained a professional demeanor, viewers familiar with his typical hosting style could see the tension in his smile and the relief in his eyes when Sean's segments finally concluded. After particularly abstract appearances, Carson would often make a quick joke to Ed McMahon, tacitly acknowledging the audience's confusion and attempting to reset the show's energy. Johnny would say things like, "Well, that's certainly one way to look at it, Dick," or "I think I need to lie down after that one," recalled a longtime viewer. It was his way of gently signaling to the audience that yes, what they just witnessed was unusual, even by Tonight Show standards. Behind the scenes, Carson was more direct about his frustration. According to staff members, he once told his producers that Sean treated the show like his own private experiment, rather than respecting the format and audience expectations. While he recognized Sean's talent and originality, Carson felt that The Tonight Show, broadcast to millions of mainstream viewers across America, was not the appropriate venue for comedy that was deliberately challenging and obscure. Despite these frustrations, Sean continued to appear on The Tonight Show periodically throughout Carson's tenure. This reflected both Carson's respect for Sean's place in the comedy world and the show's commitment to representing a wide range of comedic styles. But these appearances were carefully managed, typically shorter than average, often positioned late in the show, and frequently followed by more conventional guests who could reset the show's energy. Sean's case illustrates an interesting tension in Carson's approach to comedy. While Carson himself had an appreciation for the absurd and the unconventional, his own Karnak, the magnificent character, incorporated elements of surrealism. He believed strongly that television comedy needed to connect with the audience rather than alienate them. Performers like Sean, who seemed more interested in challenging viewers than entertaining them, represented an approach to comedy that Carson respected intellectually, but found frustrating in practice, especially when it was his job to maintain the flow and energy of a show watched by millions. It can play various parts. I suppose you could have your Crispin Glover was the guest who nearly got punched. On July 28, 1987, viewers of The Tonight Show witnessed one of the strangest and most uncomfortable interviews in the program's history, when actor Crispin Glover, best known at the time for playing George McFly in Back to the Future, took to Carson's stage in platform shoes, a wig, and bizarre attire, seemingly inhabiting a character rather than appearing as himself. What followed was nearly 6 minutes of increasingly tense television that culminated in one of the few moments when Carson appeared genuinely angry on air. Glover showed up in character, spouted nonsense, then tried to kick Johnny in the face during a demonstration. The clip went viral. Carson looked furious, recalled a staff member who was present that night. He nearly walked off mid-interview. The appearance began strangely and quickly escalated. Rather than engaging in normal conversation, Glover fidgeted nervously, spoke in a strained voice, and responded to Carson's questions with nonsensical statements and incomprehensible comments. When Carson, attempting to salvage the interview, asked about Glover's upcoming film projects, the actor pulled out a pair of clippings from old magazines and began reading random passages aloud. Carson, visibly confused but maintaining his professional demeanor, tried to establish some kind of conversational rhythm. But the breaking point came when Glover suddenly announced, "I can kick," and stood up to demonstrate, delivering a karate kick that came alarmingly close to Carson's head. The host's reaction was immediate and uncharacteristic. He physically recoiled, his face registering genuine anger rather than the mild annoyance he typically displayed with difficult guests. "I think I have to go check on the chicken backstage," Carson said curtly, beginning to rise from his chair as if to walk off the set. He ultimately remained, but the message was clear. He was on the verge of ending the segment immediately, something he rarely did, even with the most challenging guests. The audience reaction matched Carson's discomfort, with nervous laughter giving way to awkward silence as it became clear that Glover's behavior wasn't simply eccentric, but potentially hostile. Ed McMahon, usually ready with a supportive laugh or comment, sat in uncharacteristic silence, watching the scene unfold with visible concern. As the segment mercifully concluded, Carson made no attempt to hide his relief, turning to his next guest with a pointed comment about returning to our regularly scheduled program. During the commercial break, according to staff members present, Carson was visibly shaken and angry, demanding to know how such a booking had been approved and making it clear that Glover was not to be invited back. Years later, it would become apparent that Glover had been appearing in character as Reuben Farr, a role he would play in the 1991 film Reuben and Ed. At the time, however, neither Carson nor the audience had any context for the bizarre behavior, creating one of the most genuinely uncomfortable moments in the show's long history. Johnny valued guests who understood the collaborative nature of talk show appearances, explained a longtime producer. Even difficult or eccentric guests usually maintained some awareness that they were part of a show with established expectations. Glover completely rejected that understanding, treating Carson's stage as a platform for what was essentially an unannounced performance art piece. The Glover incident stands apart from other difficult guest experiences because it contained an element that was rare in Carson's interactions, a flash of genuine anger rather than mere frustration or discomfort. While Carson prided himself on his ability to handle any situation with grace and humor, Glover's physical actions, particularly the kick that came close to his face, crossed a line from merely bizarre to potentially threatening. In the aftermath, NBC executives reportedly contacted Glover's representatives to express concern about the appearance and make it clear that he would not be welcome back on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. While Carson rarely banned guests outright, the Glover incident represented an exception, a case where the host's personal safety had seemed momentarily at risk, transforming standard interview discomfort into something more serious. The clip has since become legendary in talk show history, frequently appearing in compilations of the most awkward and uncomfortable television moments. For Carson, however, it represented something beyond mere awkwardness, a rare moment when his legendary composure cracked to reveal genuine anger at a guest who had violated not just the unwritten rules of talk show etiquette, but basic standards of personal space and safety. Oliver Reed was the interview Johnny refused to air. That he does one of the three. He's Oliver Reed. The interview Johnny refused to air. Oliver Reed built his career playing intense, often menacing characters in films like Oliver, At Women in Love and The Devils. His off-screen reputation was equally formidable. A hard-drinking hellraiser known for pub brawls, outrageous behavior, and an almost pathological disregard for Hollywood conventions. When Reed appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, Carson found himself face-to-face with a guest who not only challenged his hosting skills, but triggered one of the rarest actions in the program's history: the decision not to rebroadcast a segment that had already aired live. Reed, the intense British actor, showed up belligerent and intoxicated, slurring through answers and arguing with Johnny on air, explained a former NBC executive familiar with the incident. The segment was never rebroadcast, rare for Carson. "That one doesn't get a clip reel," he told the staff afterward. From the moment Reed walked on stage, it was clear something was amiss. His gait was unsteady, his speech slurred, and his demeanor combative. While Carson was no stranger to guests who had had a few drinks before appearing, this was the 1970s after all, when pre-show alcohol consumption was not uncommon. Reed's level of intoxication went far beyond the typical loosening of inhibitions. The interview quickly descended into chaos, as Reed ignored Carson's questions, launched into rambling anecdotes, and occasionally made aggressive statements toward the host. When Carson attempted to steer the conversation toward Reed's film work, the actor responded with increasingly belligerent non-sequiturs, and at one point what appeared to be a veiled threat. Johnny had techniques for handling drunk guests, noted a former Tonight Show director. He would simplify questions, pick up the pace, sometimes even turn the intoxication into a joke if the guest was good-natured about it. But Reed wasn't just drunk, he was hostile, confrontational, almost looking for a fight. None of Carson's usual strategies worked. As the segment progressed, Carson's discomfort was palpable. His usual relaxed posture gave way to a more rigid stance. His familiar smile tightened, and his eyes frequently darted off-camera, presumably seeking guidance from his producer about whether to cut the interview short. The studio audience, normally reliable for supportive laughter even during awkward moments, fell increasingly silent as Reed's behavior became more erratic. Carson managed to conclude the segment without any complete breakdown, a testament to his professional skill even in the most challenging circumstances. But immediately after the show, he made an unprecedented decision. The Reed interview would not be included in the rebroadcast that aired in later time zones, and would never be included in any Best of Carson compilations or clip shows. "That one doesn't get a clip reel," Carson reportedly told his staff, a simple statement that conveyed the depth of his discomfort with what had transpired. In an era before YouTube and social media, this decision effectively erased the interview from public memory, with only the live Eastern Time Zone audience witnessing Reed's behavior. The Reed incident illustrates an aspect of Carson's hosting philosophy that set him apart from some of his contemporaries and successors: his belief that genuine discomfort and hostility were not entertainment. While other hosts might have replayed such an interview for its train wreck appeal or milked the controversy for publicity, Carson saw nothing valuable in showcasing a guest at their worst, particularly when that worst involved behavior that crossed the line from eccentric to genuinely unpleasant. Johnny believed the audience tuned in to be entertained, not to witness someone humiliating themselves, explained a longtime friend of Carson's. He wasn't interested in the kind of gotcha moments or public meltdowns that later became staples of certain talk shows. If a guest self-destructed on his stage, he saw that as a failure, not content to be exploited. Reed was never invited back to The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. When his name would come up in production meetings as a potential guest for subsequent films, Carson would simply shake his head and say, "I think we've seen quite enough of Mr. Reed." It was a rare instance of Carson explicitly blacklisting a guest, a decision that reflected not just personal dislike, but a fundamental belief about the kind of television he wanted to create. For a host who endured thousands of interviews across 3 decades, the decision to effectively erase one from the record speaks volumes about how deeply Reed's appearance had violated Carson's standards for his show. It wasn't just that Reed had made Carson's job difficult. He had created a type of television that Carson found antithetical to his entire approach to entertainment.